Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, braving the cold to be here today. My name is Frances Widdowson. I'm the Associate Professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies, and I'm going to introduce the series. First of all, I would like to thank the sponsors of this event. This includes the Faculty of Arts, the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies, and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. And actually the Faculty of Arts has been very helpful with this series because they have enabled funding to be reallocated to different events, and we are very appreciative of their support for the Critical Thinking series. The series itself has been organized by a group called the Rational Space Network. The Rational Space Network is a group of about 20 professors, a very loosely organized group, and what we're intent on doing is encouraging open inquiry, critical thinking, and evidence-based approaches for developing policy at Mount Royal University. Anyone can become a member of the network, and you become part of an email list getting notifications of upcoming issues. And this year, we have decided to hold this critical thinking series, which is intended to facilitate these goals of the network. There are three main threats to academic freedom and freedom of expression on campus. The first is the corporatization of the university and the increasing influence of private donors and corporations over what happens at universities. The second area is contract faculty, which we've talked about quite a lot, as this is an increasing problem at universities where contract faculty make up the large proportion of professors, and they don't have the security that full-time professors do. And the third threat is what I call politically correct totalitarianism. Now, what politically correct totalitarianism is people who think that they know what's right, and this gives them the moral authority to try to stop other points of view from being expressed on campus. And while the first two threats to academic freedom and freedom of expression are talked about quite a lot on university campuses, the third, politically correct totalitarianism, kind of goes under the radar. And this critical thinking series is an attempt to push back against politically correct totalitarianism. And we've organized a number of events to try to do this. We had a couple of events in the fall where we examined the Israel-Palestine conflict. We also looked at the question of whether universities should vet who speaks on campus. And those two events are on YouTube, on the Rational Space Network's YouTube channel. And this event is going to be recorded as well. A third event that we were hoping to have in the winter, we couldn't hold because we were not able to get the event organized in the way that we wanted by having two opposing speakers. And so we're really hoping that the two events that we have planned for the winter now, which is this one and the one on March 15th, are going to unfold as has been intended. The events that we've been holding have faced considerable opposition on campus. There's a number of professors at Mount Royal who have been encouraging other people not to participate in the critical thinking series. Also, there have been other events scheduled at exactly the same time on the same topic, but with a celebratory theme, presumably to divert people to those events. So I think that this is, part of the larger problem, and this is connected to politically correct totalitarianism, whereby there's sort of a message that's been given that everyone should feel comfortable, no one should get upset, and in fact MRU's slogan, "You belong here," I think feeds into this, because the notion is that certain people have identities that they hold very dearly, and if you start to challenge how they perceive themselves or their group, that means that, perhaps those views shouldn't be uttered. And I think this is a very serious problem at universities. And this series is an attempt to show that, we can discuss these contentious issues in an academic context. And although people might feel some discomfort about it, that's not a bad thing. It's good to kind of try and hear different points of view and try to understand what possible challenges that there might be to various positions. And nowhere is this going to be more apparent than in our event that we're going to be holding on March 15th. The event that we're holding is on the question, does trans activism undermine or negatively impact women's rights? That's the question that we're going to be asking. And Megan Murphy, who's a feminist from Vancouver, is going to argue yes, it does. And Julie Ray Epstein, a trans activist from California, is going to argue no, it doesn't. And I think this is going to be the first time at a university in Canada where this question has been examined at a university. So we're really looking forward to that, being able to do that. There has been quite a lot of opposition already to this, however, whereby some faculty members have been commenting. I haven't been privy to these discussions, but I have heard that they're going on, that this question is a problem because it could make trans students or trans faculty or trans staff feel that they're not welcome at the university, or it could make them feel uncomfortable. And what we want to say is that no one wants to have an environment where anyone's discriminated against, but at a university we should be able to discuss contentious issues. That's what universities are for, and I'm hoping that this event will show that even when you discuss an issue that is contentious as this, it actually can lead to more understanding than existed before the event took place. This particular event, I'm very, very interested to hear how it's going to unfold. Although it's not as controversial as the other events that have been held, I think that the question is one of the most fundamental questions of our time, which is the existing economic and political system that we have. Is this the right system? Is it a sustainable system? And so I'm really looking forward to hearing the different positions on this subject and seeing how different questions are asked and how they're answered. And to assist us in this, in terms of who's been invited, we have two speakers. The first is Tom Flanagan, who is a professor from the University of Calgary, Professor Emeritus. Dr. Flanagan has written several books on Canadian politics and Indigenous issues, and he also has served as an advisor in conservative political campaigns. The other speaker is Albert Howard. Albert Howard is an independent researcher and writer and teacher. Mr. Howard has some background in this area because he was a member of the League for Socialist Action during the 1970s. He participated in the anti-Vietnam War movement, as well as the Henry Morgentaler fight for abortion rights for women. He currently is working on a book concerning the social effects of religion. So if you could please help me in welcoming both Dr. Flanagan and Mr. Howard to Mount Royal. I'll now turn it over to the moderator, Miriam Napping, to discuss things further. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francis. So, as Francis said, my name is Miriam Napping. I'm Chair of Student Counseling Services. And it is unlikely a surprise to you that as a counseling psychologist, I enjoy facilitating effective communication, and that I help people to embrace feeling uncomfortable during difficult conversations. So I welcome you to try that out. So being a moderator for something like this is a great fit for me. And I also see that there are currently many barriers to having effective public conversations, and so having an opportunity to be part of one that encourages careful listening, a meaningful investigation of ideas, is really something I don't want to miss. So how do we accomplish this? So there are two main ways. One of them is that we have some structure for today's conversation, and some agreements about how we will engage in those conversations. So I'm going to read this out so I get it right. First, we will follow a structure that allows for uninterrupted sharing of ideas, and we'll do a toss of the coin, and Albert and Tom will, through that, decide who goes first, and then they will each have 15 minutes for their opening remarks. And then they'll each have 5 minutes to respond to each other. Then Jerry Cross, beside me here, and Bill Glansman will each take a turn, and Jerry Cross will first ask Tom and Albert a question each. Bill will ask Tom and Albert a question each, and then Jerry will ask Tom a question, and Bill will ask Albert a question. All of this I will moderate, so there's no need to remember any of this. So the task that Bill and Jerry have is to lead us in a kind of questioning that helps us to gain a deeper understanding of the speaker's ideas. So perhaps understand their assumptions, the principles that drive their positions, why this matters to them, and so on. And then it'll be your turn to come to the microphone. So I've put some bits of paper and pen around the room, so that you can, as you're listening, you can develop your understanding and jot down some of your questions. And then when you come to the microphone, you're free to provide a preamble to your question, so a few sentences, but I invite you to keep it short. If you would like the 10 minutes that Tom and Albert get, you're going to have to talk to Francis and see whether or not you can be an invited speaker. So we want you to get to the question. So the second way that we will work toward a respectful public conversation is that I get to call you on what I like to call hurly-burly moves. These are the kinds of things that people do often during public engagements like this that interrupt proceedings. So that might include, yelling out things and interfering in the process, maybe lobbying accusations at the person expressing the idea rather than challenging the idea itself, or name-calling. And there's, that sideways name-calling tactic where you say, I'm not calling you stupid, but if you had any intelligence at all, you wouldn't be saying the things you're saying. So what my job is today, too, is to scan for these hurly-burly moves, and I'm going to call you on them, not to shut you down, but to invite you to reframe your question. So I'm going to bring the coin to you for the toss. I guess I'll toss it, and you can... who wants to call out? Tom, how about you?
Okay. Yes.
It is heads, Tom, so you get to choose who goes first. Okay.
Well, it's a pleasure to see a lot of people out here that I haven't met before, and one very special student that I did meet before. I won't say how many years ago that was. But glad to see you again here, Miriam. So the question is capitalism sustainable? Wikipedia, my preferred source, briefly defines capitalism as, quote, an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Now, these are clearly important characteristics of capitalism, but I would say that open markets with freely moving prices are even more essential. But I don't want to quibble about details. Everybody agrees that those things are all part of what we mean by capitalism. Now, the word itself did not come into common usage until the late 19th century. Karl Marx wrote a great deal about capital, but he rarely used the word capitalism. Personally, I prefer Adam Smith's phrase, the system of natural liberty, or Friedrich Hayek's term, spontaneous order, but I'll stick with capitalism this afternoon. There were, of course, pre-capitalist forms of economy. For example, Marx spoke of the, quote, primitive communism prevailing in hunting-gathering or early agricultural societies, which knew barter, but not markets, because money had not yet been invented. One could also mention more advanced forms of economy based on slavery or serfdom, in which markets existed, but land and labor were not freely traded. But I think this afternoon we want to talk about modern industrial and post-industrial economies characterized by advanced technology, division of labor, the existence of money, and the exchange of commodities, including land, labor, and intellectual property. Whatever we wish to call it, capitalism is the only system of economic organization yet discovered that can provide individual freedom and a high standard of living in an industrial society. The historical record on this issue is crystal clear. All attempts to create a socialist alternative to capitalism based on state ownership of the means of production and state administration of the market have ended not only in totalitarian dictatorship, but also in the impoverishment of the very people that socialism was supposed to benefit. This was the fate of the Soviet Union and all its European satellites, which fortunately emerged from socialist dictatorship around 1990. In Asia, the People's Republics of China and Vietnam escaped political collapse, but have adopted capitalist economic practices on a large scale. I had good fortune to make a trip to Vietnam a couple of years ago. It's the most capitalist economy I've ever been in. The sidewalks have been privatized, little businesses set up everywhere. American dollars traded on the, is used to buy everything. Health and education are largely private for anybody who has any money at all. Still has an archaic one-party form of government, but the economy has been largely privatized. Cuba is still mired in despotism and poverty, and as if all this evidence were not enough, we now have the tragic example of Venezuela. Once considered the richest country in Latin America, Bolivarian socialism has so transformed its economy that its major export is now people. 3 million refugees, about 10% of its population, as tabulated by the United Nations at the end of 2018. Although the porcine leadership remains obviously well-fed, the average weight loss of the general population is estimated to be almost 20 pounds per person because of the shortage of foods, medicine, and other basic commodities. One could also point to the natural experiments of Germany and Korea, divided into capitalist and socialist zones in the aftermath of World War II. In both cases, despite a common cultural background, the capitalist portion thrived, while the socialist portion remained mired in poverty and tyranny. In view of this massive amount of historical evidence, the question for this afternoon should be not, is capitalism sustainable, but why is socialism not sustainable? Actually, that question was answered decades ago by the so-called Austrian School of Economics, particularly by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. The economy is fundamentally about putting knowledge and information to work for human benefit. And there is simply too much knowledge and information dispersed among billions of people to be controlled by a single intelligence or a group of minds. Administration of the market by setting prices and quantities makes superhuman and unfulfillable demands upon human intelligence. No leader, committee, or bureaucracy can ever know enough to control the details of production and distribution of millions of products among billions of people. Market exchange according to price signals is the best way we have for finding the right prices and quantities of all the things that we desire. I'm old enough that I had the experience of traveling a bit in Eastern Europe in the socialist period before the wall came down. And the failure of supply and demand to match was so evident. You young people maybe are going to have to live through this again somewhere. But I would stroll on the streets of East Berlin, and everybody carried a shopping bag just in case something would become available for sale. And lines would materialize as if by magic. I remember one day I was a nice spring day walking along the streets, and suddenly there was this big line. So I went over and I said, "What are you lining up for?" And they said, "Bananas." Shipment of bananas that just come in from Cuba or Africa or one of the outriders of the socialist system. And this was in June when people in West Germany were gorging themselves on cherries and strawberries and asparagus and so on. And in East Berlin, the stores were filled with potatoes and onions and cabbage. People weren't starving, but it was not a very inspiring diet. It was a failure to match what people were interested in with what could be produced. And that was because there wasn't a freely moving price system. There were no signals to tell producers what to produce and consumers what they could afford. It was all done by administrative decree, which always got it wrong. Capitalism is also the best known way of unleashing human creativity and innovation. In addition to despotism and poverty, socialist regimes have been notorious for the derivative and conservative character of their intellectual and cultural life. Socialist regimes do not produce books that anyone wants to read, games that anyone wants to play, pictures that anyone wants to view, or music that anyone wants to listen to. There were great communist writers and artists, such as Bertolt Brecht and Pablo Picasso, but their memorable work was produced in the freedom of capitalist regimes. The intellectual life and artistic culture of the modern world is capitalist, full stop. All of this would have been self-evident to most observers in the 1990s after the socialist world had collapsed. But 3 decades have passed, and the new generation has no first-hand experience of what socialism actually amounted to. Thus, young people are drawn once again to the vision of a socialist economy and society. And indeed, it is a beautiful vision, replete with material abundance and equality, and updated with 100% renewable energy. But it is just that, a vision, a dream state. You can visualize anything you want to when you are dreaming, but when you awake, you have to deal with the realities of human nature and economic behavior. No one can predict what human existence will be like 100 or 1,000 years in the future, but for now, capitalism is a hands-down winner among economic systems.
That was, Dr. Flanagan was very brief there, and maybe I could use the extra authority you said.
15
Sure you wouldn't mind. When I first gathered my thoughts about the question, is capitalism sustainable, it occurred to me that a more appropriate question would be, can humanity survive capitalism? And Dr. Flanagan also suggested an alternative title. Capitalism is actually at the end of its trajectory. The relentless pursuit of profit has now superseded its utility. What was once a response to human needs has now descended to the creator of social wants. Historically, civilized society can be divided into 3 main epochs: slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, each determined by the different ways the upper classes extract the surplus value produced by labor. Each epoch has a trajectory that ends with the preconditions for the next historical segment. Slavery became possible through the division of labor, through agriculture, and the making of goods for sale. Workers produced more than was required for their maintenance, and this surplus value was taken by those who held possession of the means of production. They became privileged and wealthy. As morally abhorrent as we see it today, in the period of the Greeks and Romans, this greed-inspired surplus contributed to certain progress. Wheeled carts, the plow, writing, architecture, philosophy, and more. And this came out of that oppressive regime. The eventual stagnation of slavery, though, led to its replacement by feudalism. Serfs and peasants had greater freedom and access to the land, and trade made the use of capital possible. But before capitalism could be established as a world economic system, a new kind of transaction had to occur. Workers without property hired themselves out to the owners of the means of production. Labor became one of their inputs, along with raw materials and tools for capitalist production. Capitalism was a great accelerator of productive forces as it responded to the need for more efficient production and efficacious technology. But when its dynamism came to fulfill all objective needs, it began to invent wants. That is the condition for the next epoch, and capitalism is at that stage right now. Private ownership of the means of production breeds conflict, inequality, a competitive culture, and chaotic economies. The end of capitalism will allow for cooperation, rational policies, planned economics, and an end to the destruction of our environment. I'll get to the more far-reaching effect that really addresses the question of whether we can survive capitalism. But first I want to touch on some of the immediate social effects of capitalism. There are many areas where we can see that capitalism is socially negative. Health services and the pharmaceutical industry. There is Big Pharma, the profit-driven controller of our health services, that refuses to produce medicines for rare diseases because there aren't enough profits, but creates products for imagined illnesses and invented threats. Then the pharmaceutical firms, I don't know if people know this, I was shocked to hear it. They pay doctors who prescribe their products, corrupting the integrity of our health providers. The industry lobbies for government-run pharmacare programs so they can really peddle their wares to people on the public dime. But it's a terrible example which epitomizes what the pharmaceutical industry is all about. The pursuit of profit is the thalidomide tragedy of the 1960s. People, the victims of thalidomide have recently been in the news, so you might be aware of it. The drug was introduced in Germany and the UK to reduce morning sickness in pregnancy. Canada began marketing the drug in mid-1961. In December of that year, Germany and England reported incidents of birth defects among women who took the drug and banned it. The U.S. had never started because of a lack of sufficient research, but the pharmaceutical company producing it excuse me, was giving doctors samples to encourage demand. However, the Canadian drug company, Frank W. Horner, stated that they would keep selling it until the Canadian authorities banned it. In March of '62, it was finally banned, but hundreds of defective births resulted from the 4 months that it was marketed. This is an example of the pursuit of profit over the interests of humanity. And it's not just an example of error of judgment or individual greed. It is the essence of a system that has profit as its primary objective. Now just imagine if we nationalized the pharmaceutical industry. Research and development would be assigned to the universities, which could use the funding. To develop drugs that address human need. Patents would be eliminated. Intellectual property would be public property. The manufacturing process would be done by something like a crown corporation. That would be demand rather than supply driven. That would vastly lower the cost of drugs, increase the distribution to those who need them, and stop the interference in scientific medical diagnosis. In agriculture, food is a business. From factory farming of chemical saturated animals to the modified agricultural products that are developed to produce larger and less nutritious fruits and vegetables, all in the name of profit over the fulfillment of human needs, results in the many illnesses and unhealthy lifestyles currently endured in the developed countries. The first Canada food guides, maybe not the first, but as it progressed, the first ones were in 1942 and were responding to the shortages caused by the Second World War. But as it developed, the input was from the food companies like Campbell's, Libby, and General Foods, and Nestle, and now PepsiCo. And public demand for healthier foods led the Canadian government to include scientific input, and a balance was made between nutritious food and the interests of packaged goods manufacturers, who, to create or increase demand for their products, were adding sugar, salt, and trans fats. The recent guide that just came out and is in the news met with fierce opposition by the juice producers, because when it was recognized that fruit juices were concentrated sugar equivalent to soft drinks, this was met with lobbying by something called the Canada Juice Council, a body devoted to nothing more than the preservation of profit in the beverage industry. The fact that sugar-heavy fruit juice is harmful was never a consideration of the lobby, because the economic impact on the industry was forefront. In third world countries, children are starving to death or consuming insufficient food and dirty water, due to the fact that they can't afford the food that is wasted by the richer first world peoples, where farmers burn grain, dump milk in order to keep prices up. In fact, we already produce enough to feed the world population. There's just no profit in feeding more people. And then there's the capitalist political system. Political party funding and intense lobbying means that capitalist wealth influences government policy, including funding for environmental science. In order to maintain the social privilege and material wealth of the upper class, political systems depend on state authorities to keep order and the rights of property. The mere existence of trade unions is evidence of the inherent conflicts of capitalism. It is in the interest of profit to keep production costs low, and one of the most elastic elements of those is labor. The law of supply and demand means unemployment benefits capitalism by way of keeping wages down and maintaining a ready supply of workers. Through technology, the automakers, for example, use fewer work hours to produce a car now than when Henry Ford started his production lines. But that doesn't mean that doesn't benefit humanity, because technology belongs to the corporation, not to the workers. Now, what has developed and what we live in is a capitalist culture. Capitalism creates a culture of individualism that could be called social Darwinism. Rather than natural selection, this idea assumes survival through greed, selfishness, and conquest. It emphasizes getting ahead. And getting ahead means getting ahead of someone else. It ignores natural social needs and the possibility of self-actualization. The current emphasis is also on entrepreneurialism. Entrepreneurialism is the practice of thinking up things to sell people. If there were an existing need, you wouldn't have to think it up. In this process in marketing lingo is called primary demand marketing, meaning there is no demand for the gimmick you thought up, and a strategy must be designed to make people want it. Just think, where would we be without Facebook? And capitalism manipulates us. For instance, the disguise of unhealthy activities as rights. The tobacco industry sponsored smokers' rights associations and brought out e-cigarettes as a pretension of helping to stop smoking. But these things work to keep smokers addicted to nicotine and the likelihood that you may go back to cigarettes. In fact, the lie that vapes are harmless leads many non-smokers to try them for the first time. Another capitalist success story. Capitalist culture encourages the belief that the consumer is responsible for the consumption of the unhealthy goods that it produces. How often does the media suggest that we shouldn't eat junk food? But billions of dollars are spent encouraging us to do so. And look at car advertising. Competition is encouraged as a capitalist virtue. The value of cooperation, empathy, and social contribution are historical remnants, and aren't competitive people fun to deal with. And finally, the environment. The effects of capitalism at this point in history are alarming. Get massive wealth for some while others literally starve. Constant conflict as the norm. The view of people as a market. The denial of basic goods for many, but the greatest threat to our existence is the destruction of the environment that we depend upon for our sustenance. The capacity of the planet to maintain our population of almost 8 billion is severely stretched. While we do need to control population growth, the destruction of the source of our existence continues exponentially. All efforts to control or correct this impending catastrophe are met with resistance from capitalism, starting with the claim that environmental destruction is human-caused, shifts the blame to us as individuals. Environmental destruction is caused by the capitalist economic system. Fake news manufactured by climate change deniers extends to other environmental threats, from disposable plastic to fossil fuel production in the tar sands, to the profiteering tourism in the Great Barrier Reef and the deforestation of our woodlands. The pseudoscience initiative has created a level of public confusion and doubt about global warming. This in turn makes it more difficult for policymakers to address the problem. The now of scientific evidence of the destruction of our environment has sprung a number of lobby groups and associations opposing scientific, peer-reviewed conclusions. This is in the interest of maintaining the status quo rather than a sustainable environment for the benefit and enjoyment for all. There are many associations supported by the massive funds of capital that have the objective of discrediting scientific evidence. The first thing to consider when we're confronted by arguments by deniers is the source of their funding. University and government-funded research is paid for by the public in the interest of the public. But a polarization around environmental issues has increased and has led to public uncertainty. Corporate funding vastly exceeds the public spending on scientific research into the causes of global warming and appropriate policy development. The result is a growing public opposition to global warming science and a turning towards simplified and hypocritically sponsored propaganda. Among the founders of the denial organizations are successful capitalists as the billionaire Koch brothers and their like, Exxon and the many foundations for the exclusive purpose of creating public uncertainty and protecting profits. Funding by industry and individual donors means they have a reason to discredit evidence that harms their bottom line. As long as the interest of capital is maintained, the closer we get to environmental destruction and extinction. That's the real sustainability question. Thank you.
So, want me to take 5 minutes and?
You have 5 minutes, but you can do it from there if you like, or come back to the mic.
Yeah, I'll come
Whatever.
first. Okay, first of all, a very fundamental question, the role of profit. Profit is part of the market. It's a signal, the making of profits is a signal that there are demands to be fulfilled. It's a signal to producers to get into that business. It's part of the price system. If you don't have a freely moving prices of which profit is a part, then you have to administratively determine quantities of production and distribution. So basically what you will have is an entire society run like the post office. It will be one huge crown corporation, and it'll be probably not nearly as efficient as the Canadian Post Office, because the post office exists in a market environment in which information about prices, and there's competition with the post office. There are other people that deliver advertising, and so there's some way to know what prices should be. In the absence of a price system including profit, then what you have is an administered society which will never get anything right. That's actually the fundamental point of distinction between Albert and myself. He wants to have an administered society without a price system. I say it won't work. I say the historical record shows that it hasn't worked, and there's good theoretical reasons for why it can't work. Then Albert gives a long catalog of distressing things that he lays at the door of capitalism. Look, it's an imperfect world. Bad things happen constantly. But a free society in which the market prevails allows countervailing forces to emerge. Yes, thalidomide was awful, although it arose from the good intention of developing a medicine that would help women with pregnant mothers with morning sickness. Limitations of knowledge meant that it didn't work out as hoped, but very quickly countervailing forces emerged, and thalidomide was taken off the market. It didn't happen within seconds, but it happened within months and a couple of years, depending on the country. And so that's one example. Smoking is another one. Yes, profit-seeking companies put tobacco on the market and invented inexpensive ways to enjoy it, like manufacturing cigarettes. I got my PhD at Duke University in the United States. Duke fortune was based on the exploitation of tobacco. But countervailing forces emerged. So now there's huge social movements against smoking, and the prevalence of it has been reduced. Environmental degradation, well, first of all, the record of the socialist countries in practice was appalling. Environmental degradation was rife throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. When a socialist system in practice was given a chance to perform, there was no concern for the environment at all, and that's largely true of China today. So our record of environmental preservation may be imperfect, but it's far better than that of socialist alternatives. And starvation in the third world, well, the record of the growth of international trade in recent decades after the collapse of socialism is that billions of people have been removed from the risk of starvation. Food production has increased. Wealth in the third world has increased. Has it helped everybody? No, not yet. But it has certainly helped the poor in many countries who have been able to advance much further than they ever could before. And as far as global warming, what can I say except bring it on?
Well, just commented. Dr. Flanagan with his final remark there. I'm very. There are a number of things that Dr. Flanagan brought up. The things that are basically in favor of a class that exists above everyone else, benefits from them, and exploits them. And this is sometimes suggested as some kind of success. Let's talk, well, some of the so-called socialist countries. Socialism is a concept that has to be universal or international. The slogan, "Workers of the World Unite," indicates that. There isn't room. Look what happens when workers in a particular area overthrow the capitalist exploiting government. The American imperialists and their allies move in and boycott them and drive them into a situation where there's food shortages and all kinds of things. And then they move in and support a political group that opposes the socialist government. And you see that all the time, and they support them. So they create this internal havoc and shortages and everything else in the first place, and then blame the socialist government, which is always nascent and at the time. Cuba, Cuba happens to have the highest literacy rate in the world. It's quite a few points above the United States. That is a human value that I think nobody could deny, and it is one of the human things that Cuba has done. Everybody goes to school. Medical help, medical services are absolutely free. Cuba's economy. Well, let's look at the circumstances, the objective circumstances. First of all, their economy is based on two things that are now just persona non grata: tobacco and sugar. Well, these people are stuck. They were assisted by the Soviet Union. Before the Soviet Union suffered the same circumstances and were eventually crowded out of the world economy. China is an odd example. There's the most right-wing anti-socialist and capitalist entity right now. We can see we're all worried about them intruding on our electronic systems and so on. And what are some of the other dates here? Sorry. Should we not? Well, Dr. Flanagan pointed out in the criticisms of capitalism as it is, that we simply live in an imperfect world, and I guess we shouldn't struggle to improve that. We should look at the core reasons why that is. If we have a class society, as long as we have one class dominating another class, we are going to have perpetual conflict. And we are going to have all of the things that I outlined that are the differences in the way people live in the world is because there's a class that sucks all of the value out of it and then has to form foundations and all the things to put it back in. But look at the control this gives them. They decide who they give it to. what areas of society they support, and what areas of the society that they don't like. Well, anything on the left is never supported, and all kinds of right-wing initiatives. And that's where the capitalist accumulation of money, like the Koch brothers, these people are disgusting. They have billions of dollars under their personal control, and all I have to say is some children are starving. If that's happening, that's enough. We cannot support this kind of extreme polarization of the value produced in the world. And that's why we are going to, I'm off criticism of Flanagan here, but that's why we have to be really concerned about the environment, because capitalist profit is driving it, and we definitely have to overcome that. The next thing I was going to say. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, I will hand the mic over to Jerry to ask each of the speakers a question.
Tom, first of all, I will ask you, one of your arguments as to why capitalism is a superior system is the profit motive. So could you elaborate a bit on that? How does the mechanism of price signals work, and why does it produce desirable outcomes?
Is this working or not yet? How's it working? Yeah, okay. Profit is part of the price system. Profit is a signal that people want something. If you can make a profit by offering goods for sale or performing services for people, that's a signal to others to get into that same market and offer those. So profit is a kind of a self-limiting thing. If the market is freely competitive, other producers will get in there, and basically the cost will be stabilized at a level which includes just barely enough profit to keep the enterprise going, as long as competitors are free to join in. The situations that people criticize are typically those where competition isn't open, and so producers can extract higher than market profits. But anyway, profit is really the motor of progress. It's when new goods and services are invented. Initially, the price is often high and profits are great, and that's a signal for new competitors to get in there. And so we have seen way in our own time, just within your own lifetimes, all the young people here, waves of innovation in the IT industry, which, by the way, just in passing, have created a new crop of billionaires who far outclass the Koch brothers, Tom Steyer and Jeff Bezos, and there's far more money now going into causes of the left from billionaires than there are into causes of the right from the Koch brothers. But that's just a sideline. Profit is the mechanism of innovation, the desire for profit, and the desire to compete with those who are making profits. Without profit, we don't have innovation. And this was, again, one of the main characteristics of the socialist societies as they actually existed. They were not innovative. They were static. They were conservative in a very bad sense. And to the extent that they progressed, it was by getting imports, or sometimes by stealing processes from the innovative Western countries. So profit is absolutely essential. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And we wouldn't enjoy all the wonderful things around us if it weren't for the profit motive. So it's absolutely essential. If you don't have profit to guide your activities, then you have to do it through some kind of administrative authority. And administrative authorities are about the least creative and innovative people in the world. So instead of visualizing the world as one giant post office, I will take the chaos of the market because it's creative and innovative.
Albert, you spoke about some of the negative aspects of price signals. For example, you spoke about some of the negative aspects of price signals. For example, the creation of artificial demand, pharmaceutical companies not investing in research into new antibiotics because other drugs are more profitable. So my question to you is, do you think these examples are inherent in the capitalist system? Or could they be dealt with by regulation or perhaps the development of countervailing forces?
Hello? Yeah. Well, when if you look at the whole purpose of the pharmaceutical industry is profit, and so without it, you can't regulate. The only regulation that you could really have that would make a significant distinction is if you eliminated the profit motive. And you could do that for sure. You could force them to produce goods that are for rare diseases and so on. But you would have to. They would just want more money from the taxation to supplement that, because their primary condition is that they make a profit. That is the first consideration before they do anything. And if we did have, this meeting is about, or debate is about capitalism, not socialism, but socialism is the next epoch that humanity will progress to. And at that time, as I mentioned when I was speaking, things would be produced according to need, not creating wants, as you mentioned, but and not for the purpose of making a profit, but for the purpose of satisfying human needs. So that people are released from this not freedom, but are given freedom from this capitalist culture that says we must compete with one another at all times.
Yeah, Tom, I'm going to take slightly different tact. I'm not an economist. By way of apology, I'm an archaeologist, so I'm more into the arts and such. So let me just pose this. If I understood you correctly, correct me if I am wrong, you seem to suggest that there's something about human creativity, like the production of books, great works of art, and that sort of thing, under socialism that is either not considered great or is not really considered desirable by people. Can you explain why this seems to be the case?
Sure. And I'll go take to Albert's concern with pharmaceuticals. If you went back 100 years ago, there were virtually no important medicines. You know, there were folk medicines, willow bark and so forth. But the explosion of medicines that we've seen in the 20th and 21st century has been carried out by profit-seeking companies based in Switzerland and the United States and Great Britain and other capitalist countries. I'm not aware of any important medicine developed in a socialist country anywhere. Maybe there is, and if there is, I'd be happy to hear about it, but I'm not aware of it. Is it imperfect? Yes. Some medicines are extremely expensive, but we're only concerned about these niche medicines that are so expensive because the wonderful discoveries that have taken place within the capitalist economy of things like antibiotics and inoculations have managed to, if not completely conquer, at least fend off the historic killers of mankind. So would that have happened if the whole pharmaceutical industry had been organized as one department with a wise committee in charge of to tell it what medicines to develop? Absolutely not. None of that would have happened. The wonderful medicines that we enjoy today are one of the blessings of capitalism, and they are saving lives in our society and around the third world. And companies often, not always, but often make medicines available at below cost, like for example for the treatment of AIDS. But medicines for these niche diseases are very expensive to develop, and they're not less expensive to develop if they're developed in some kind of administered gigantic worldwide Department of Health. It's the pursuit of profit which unleashes human creativity, and the pharmaceuticals are one example, but there's so many other examples. The IT revolution, I didn't know I needed a personal computer until somebody invented it. I couldn't have a need for it until it was there. Somebody had to persuade me that it was worthwhile. I mean, most of what we enjoy today are things that did not exist in your period of study of archaeology when people got along with stone tools and campfires. Yeah, you could exist that way. A small population could exist that way. But the things that we enjoy had to be invented and imitated by others, and in a capitalist society marketed in order for us to realize how useful they could be. Now, are some of them frivolous and even harmful? Yeah, for sure. Lots of them I find kind of silly and I don't use, but I pick out the ones that I think are important for me. So that's really what it's all about, is the release of human intelligence and capitalizing on the creativity of all people, not just a few, but of all people, and linking these people together through the market, which nobody controls, but which allows everybody to make his own contribution.
Thank you for that, and to Albert then. Maybe I can create a little bit of a foil here, if you'll allow me. Can you explain how capitalism has either contributed to or stifled human creativity? Tom has just addressed some of these issues with respect to the medicine and pharmaceuticals. I'm looking more at things such as the works of art, literature, that sort of thing. And can you explain why that seems to be the case?
Why, what seems to be the case? That capitalism...
That capitalism has either contributed to or stifled that creativeness.
Human creativity, first of all, is a human characteristic. It isn't dependent upon capitalism to release it. Capitalism, if it has done anything, has distorted it into the pet rock and all of the negative things that are foisted on our society by the imposition of wants rather than the satisfaction of needs. Human beings have to be freed to go back to their fundamental capabilities, which has we've had creativity we've seen them in cave paintings and drawings. That capacity has always been there, and it is not promoted by capitalism, but held back by controlling it and incorporating it into capitalist culture of competition and so on. I think that we have to recognize that there is collateral benefits in the capitalist societies. Capitalism, in the trajectory that I described before, started out to respond to the human needs, and it did a great job of that. Look at the development of the automobile stopped us relying on horses, and it's all of the things associated with that, which were labor saving and gave us more leisure time, more time for personal and human development. But the problem was that these things were not owned by the people who were using them. They were owned by the people who had controlled the means of production. So workers were always given as little as possible to respond to this. And so they had to struggle to get more. If I can deviate a little bit on the idea of profit. Profit is the extra that you charge for something that it costs you to make it, the first person here being the capitalist. And that means that when it's put on the market as an aggregate, the amount of money that was put into the aggregate production of all production and all goods, the cost of the goods is greater than the cost of the labor to make it. So how are these people supposed to buy it? Well, they can't, and they try to get more money. So they have strikes, labor strikes, and so on. And we can see that, look, 100 years ago, people were making $20 a week or something, and now people are making a lot more. But what happens is they want more money in order to buy the products that they made. And when that happens, the cost of producing the products that they made goes up. So the price goes up. So we have this vicious circle of constantly people crying. It's called inflation. And it's either low or high, but it never stops. We have capitalist economists aim for an ideal of 2% inflation every year. Well, why don't we have no inflation? That's what economists call perfect trade, when you trade for something that's of equal value. Now that eliminates that element that doesn't do anything but use their own money to make more money. Because that's where all that money is going. It's creating these huge overflow of money. The Koch brothers. They're such a great example because they're such a terrible social force.
Tom, near the end of your opening remarks, you spoke about the vision that some young people have of a socialist society and economy, which you described as a beautiful vision replete with material abundance and equality, and updated with 100% renewable energy. My question is, how can capitalism better deliver such a vision and deal with some of the problems that we're currently facing?
Well, first of all, for material abundance, capitalism has delivered and is delivering it. Canada is an incredibly wealthy country. Albert portrays it as a sort of proletarian masses living in poverty, but that's not the Canada that we know. Yes, there are some poor people in Canada of certain ethnic groups are excluded, and there are people with personal reasons, but 90% plus of Canadians are living better than the aristocracy of 200 years ago. They have lots to eat and warm houses and cars and computers and televisions, and they send their kids to universities like this. So capitalism clearly creates abundance, and it's spreading it throughout the world. Nations like China and India, which have adopted more capitalist practices, are quickly moving ahead economically. So abundance is no problem for capitalism. Moralists may not like how people use their abundance, but that's a different issue. That's wanting to impose your judgment over that of other people. Now, what was the second part of your question? How we'll deal with environmental challenges? Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, look at the environmental movement. It's the most powerful force in politics today. It's brought the economy of Alberta to its knees. And if something isn't done about that, you'll all quickly learn what happens when capitalism can't work. But environmentalism is a powerful force. This is one of these countervailing things that I've talked about that arises within the matrix of a market economy. Now, not all so-called environmental problems are really problems. That's a different issue, is you have to look and investigate which problems are actually real problems and which are figments of the imagination. And there have been a whole series of scares, environmental scares, going back to the, well, I guess Silent Spring is the first big example, but there's been the population bomb scare, and minor scares like the LR scare, and now we have the, and then there was in the 1970s, there was the fear of the new ice age, to be quickly replaced by the global warming scare, and maybe now some people are talking about that was wrong, and maybe there will be an ice age after all, which historically would probably be a pretty good bet, since we're living in an interglacial period probably for the last couple of million years. It's been one ice age after another. I can't claim to know, but a free society with a market economy gives birth to all kinds of corrective movements, social movements, of which environmentalism is one. And like every other movement, it has its good and bad points, but it gets in there, and you know, people try and counteract what they see as excesses of the market. But I'll tell you, there was no environmental movement in the socialist countries. The Soviet Union, that would get you put in prison if you proclaimed yourself to be an environmentalist. There were no countervailing forces in those socialist countries until the system collapsed. While I'm riffing on this one final point, Albert was talking about Cuba and how they're poor because all they produce is sugar and tobacco. Well, why is that all they're producing? Before Castro, Cuba was one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. You know, it's, what was it, 90 miles from Florida. Anybody ever seen the musical Guys and Dolls? People from New York used to fly down to Havana for the weekend, and if nature had taken this course, Cuba would be integrated into the North American economy today. So the fact that it's only producing tobacco and sugar isn't the fact of nature or a fact of capitalism. It's because the government has stifled the economy so that it couldn't get integrated into a larger world economy and produce other things. So the poverty is self-imposed. It's not a fact of geography or anything like that. That's not really an answer to your question, but I have to say it.
Okay. Let's go.
Okay, another apology. Often I tell my students that if it ain't dead or broken, I'm really not interested as an archaeologist. That's a flippant remark. However, the future is on everybody's mind, Albert, and especially given recent global developments that we hear about in the news every day. If I understand you correctly, you seem to have a fatalist attitude for the future if capitalism is to continue on its present trajectory. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Do you believe there could be a marriage of concepts and practices from both capitalism and socialism that can be entertained for the future of humankind? And in this regard, I'm thinking specifically of socio-political and economic experiments and practices as have been introduced and are currently underway in countries in Western Europe, such as Denmark, Sweden, and the like.
Well, social democracy is a form of compromise, and I think that's what you're talking about. And it is, we could recognize that as a step in the right direction of eliminating capitalism and the threat that it is to humanity in general. The point is that capitalism has come to the end of its trajectory. It is no longer, all of any usefulness that it ever had is depleted. And as I mentioned in talking about the epochs of human development, the end of each trajectory contains the elements that create the next epoch. And next epoch, and we haven't, I've been avoiding talking directly with socialism. Next epoch is very likely, obviously, socialism. And what do we have? Well, we have some highly developed, productive technology. We have incredible stuff. When we look at the most famous revolution, of course, is the Russian Revolution. And here they had a backward economy, a backward public, and terrible circumstances, hard to grow stuff on rocks. And that this was what caused the overthrow of the Tsars, who were taking whatever benefits there were and accumulating it to themselves. That's what causes the overthrow. And that's the difficulty of revolutions and when in the developed countries, is because there is this ability to trickle down and keep workers happy. But what's keeping the workers in those countries happy is at the expense of workers in other countries. Mexican auto workers make $3 an hour. So a lot of the production is shipped there to make it cheaper, so that workers in the United States making $30 an hour, working in the auto plants, can afford the cars they're making. Because a whole lot of the workers, Mexicans aren't rich, they're making $3 an hour. And we have this, and we look at how many that are wearing things or have things that come from Taiwan and Bangladesh and so on, places that lock the doors so the workers can't get out, and are totally disregarding of the relationship, but we benefit from the profits, from international profits. And that's what's happening, and socialism has to be seen from the point of view of an international combination of workers cooperating with one another, rather than this competition. Even though capitalists are allied with one another in imperialist countries, they still compete with each other. And that competition is who can exploit more, the most, out of their working class.
Okay, thank you. I will come to the center of the room here and just wave if you have a question that you'd like to ask.
Thank you both very much, Mary and Carrie. It's a real pleasure to hear people speaking from a truly classical philosophical position, both on the right and the left. Very interesting. But the reality is that I think we don't live in either a purely capitalist economic society, and nor will we approach a truly socialist society soon. We live in a society where the market reigns to a certain degree, but is reined in by other kinds of regulatory systems. And I wonder if both of you could speak to that reality that we're in, and whether this kind of capitalism, which is, I suppose, fairly recent, last 50 years or so, let's say, if you could speak to the sustainability of this form of capitalism, which has some kind of restrictions embedded within it. To either of you, or both, please.
Yes, of course. There is no capitalist system in the world which is purely capitalist. In all of them, there are large parts of the economy that are administered by the state. We may not always think of them that way, but the military, for example, is a socialist institution. Public education is a socialist institution. Post office, in most countries, it's been privatized in a few countries. The question is there a good reason to depart from the market model? Sometimes there is, where there are spillovers or free rider effects, or there's a long list of situations in which the market may not perform as well as we would like, and we can attempt to use government to supplement it. But we also have to be aware that these attempts to use government are subject to what is today known as government failure. There's a lot of talk about market failure, which leads to government provision, but government provision has its own specific problems. Yes, it's a question of finding the right combination of government provision for some things, and it's seldom pure. I mean, take the military, for example. The government employs the soldiers, but the material, the procurement is done through contracts with private industry. So there's often a combination. In education, we have public school system, but we also have private alternatives. So yeah, public policy in a modern democracies is largely a search for the right combination of government provision versus the market. But I think it's still true that the government provision exists as a kind of a supplement to a largely market-driven system. And I think that's important to recognize. Even the countries that have gone the furthest in government provision of many things, like some of the Scandinavian countries, these are still clearly market-driven countries. And that generates wealth which can be used for certain purposes which may not be well served by the market. So I would agree with your basic point, and I think the system seems to be pretty robust. Take an archaeological point of view, who knows how long things will last, but from our more political point of view today, these mixed economy that we see seems to be robust. But there is a danger with it, because the government provision is really a wonderful field for rent seeking. So public education, for example, a lot of money is put into it, but who reaps the benefits? Well, teachers are organized, and no matter how much money you put into public education, you don't necessarily get better results with students, because the surplus is being creamed off by organized interests. It's true in universities, it's true in the medical care system as well. So government provision is not a magic remedy to what you may perceive as the inadequacy of capitalism. It's an alternative which has its own specific limitations.
First of all, the whole concept of a mixed economy means that the pure capitalist economy is not desirable, or is not functional, or doesn't satisfy human need, and certainly it doesn't. But a mixed economy is just trying to put reins or brakes on a runaway, chaotic system that is preoccupied with profit. So what we do is take away some of that to make it more acceptable to the general public, so the harms that it does are disguised. And when we do that, the mixed part of the economy is always seen through nationalization of things that aren't making a profit. So they're taken off their hands. You see that with transportation in England, in the UK generally. We had railway lines that weren't making any profit, not enough people using them. Some people were using them and they needed them, but that didn't matter. So then the government took them over. So now the government takes taxation dollars and helps this capitalist enterprise to survive. Instead of taking the ones that are making a lot of profit and contributing that surplus to the better good of everyone, no, that's not good. That goes to the people who own it. The fundamental problem, and what a mixed economy tries to disguise, is the fact that some people are draining excess value out of an economy that they themselves don't produce, but they get the benefit of. And that is the fundamental problem. It cannot be, none of it can be allowed. And if we had a properly organized society that generated out of the satisfaction of human need, and instead of economic development, a preoccupation with human development, so that we become more and better at what we are as human beings, rather than something I'm amazed. Dr. Fleming was talking about success. Success in the capitalist country means some people are really, really rich. How is that successful? Not unless everybody is rich, which of course, in technical terms, is impossible. Then it can't be successful in this situation. Certainly, one of the biggest problems that we face in the world and in our relationships with one another is conflict. We have to look at the sources of conflict and eliminate them. And one of the sources of conflict is class. It is somebody ripping off somebody else. Capitalists rip off workers, and that creates the conflict. And that is the root of all of the conflict that we see in one way or another. And that once we eliminate that, we can start. I don't know what can happen then, because it's such an amazing thing, this condition of being a human being.
Hi there. My name is Andre. I'm a policy studies student here at MRU. So before I ask my question, I just wanted to say I was born in Romania, so I've kind of witnessed firsthand the damage that socialism can do to a society. But at the same time, I am critical of capitalism in a couple of ways, insofar as it leads to, economic inequality on the scale that demagogues like Donald Trump or Maduro in Venezuela can take advantage of and just bring destruction to the entire system. So, I came here really being on the fence on this question of whether capitalism is sustainable or not. So I just want to thank you both for your insights on this question. Now, my question deals with sustainability, because I don't really feel like either of you really addressed this point very much. So, first of all, I just want to define sustainability because I don't think we really did that in the discussion. So, sustainability can be defined as resilience and continuity for future generations, right? I think we can all agree on that. Yes. So, I want to focus on environmental sustainability here because I think it is a huge problem for us. And if that's okay, I want to ask both of you this question individually. So Tom, I'm going to start with you. Early on you mentioned that the question shouldn't be whether capitalism is sustainable or not, but how socialism is not sustainable. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy. I think saying socialism is not sustainable doesn't make capitalism sustainable. So I just want to ask you, in what way can capitalism ensure that future generations can benefit from the same kind of material well-being that we enjoy today, while ensuring that the environment can still support and provide for them?
Well, capitalism is sustainable. The evidence is there in a number of ways. First of all, it's continued to exist and spread around the world for a couple of hundred years. There have been ups and downs for sure, but it's still going strong. Secondly, one of the problems that was raised, if you remember the book, The Limits to Growth, that appeared in the early 1970s, was that we'd be running out of raw materials. Well, this has been proven to be absolutely false. Prices of raw materials have declined unless they're artificially held up by cartels. Human ingenuity finds new deposits of minerals, it finds better ways of exploiting minerals, it finds substitutes that can be synthesized. So there's no problem at all of running out of raw materials. Then there was the population scare that we were all going to die because we're all going to starve because there would be too many people to feed. Well, the Green Revolution has provided a whole lot more food, and the number of people will, in more advanced countries, is self-limiting. Birth rates fall, and it's happening again around the world today. We're all better off actually by having more people, because there are more minds who are able to invent things and contribute to our welfare. So the latest scare is that, as Alexandria, what's-her-name says, the world is going to end in 10 years unless we adopt the new, what is it she's calling it, the new green revolution. Well, give me a break. Here's a girl who was a cocktail waitress 2 years ago, and now she's a member of Congress. This is not something to be taken seriously. So yeah, there are challenges, and there have been along the way, but a free society with a market economy has shown its ability to deal with the challenges. Now, the point about inequality, which was, you reverted to that. I mean, why is inequality bad?
Excessive inequality.
Well, what is excessive? The reason we have inequality, I mean, we're going to put it another way. Let's take a glaring example. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon and owner of the Washington Post, who's recently distinguished himself by sexting pictures of his genitals to his latest girlfriend. You know, kind of disgusting. But look at the good that he has done to the world through the creation of Amazon by creating a new form of marketing based on delivery to your house. That's a tremendous advance. Okay, so he's the richest man in the world, I think, today. I don't begrudge him his billions. I don't like his politics, but I don't begrudge him his billions because of all the good that Amazon has done and will do to people. The same is true of other extremely wealthy people. They're wealthy. You know, look at all the founders of Facebook and all, you know, the whole IT thing. That's because these are services that people really enjoy that didn't exist a generation ago, and the pioneers have gotten wealthy, but they've made us all better off because of it. Canada is not an impoverished society with a few capitalists extracting the surplus value. Canada is a very wealthy country in which almost everybody has decent housing, food, clothing, transportation, opportunities for education, health care. There's a few people who don't, and we would hope we could take care of them too, one way or another. But basically, things are pretty darn good by any historical standard. Canada and similar countries, we're living like kings. And that's due to capitalism, and I don't see any evidence that it can't be sustained into the indefinite future.
Okay, I'm going to move on to other questions.
Hello, thank you both for coming and giving us this opportunity. My question is specifically for Albert, and I just want to preface it quickly by saying my interest is not in the moral arguments you provided. I think you've made a number of them. My interest is specifically in an actual system that works. I'm interested in sort of, I guess you could say, the economics of it. You've made point to call out the evils of the system, but what I've never heard is what the next system is. So, as an example, you called out the Russian Revolution, but at the same period in time we had the Meiji Restoration, which followed a capitalist movement, and it was far more effective in creating a Japan that had poor politics but was much more desirable. At the same point in time in the 20s, we had the development of a famous thing in economics, the called Douglas function, which was a production function created because an economist noticed that the returns to labor and capital were consistent through years, and that's remained roughly true. I know that's a simplistic explanation of that. So given that we've heard all of these examples of socialist systems that do not work, East and West Germany, North and South Korea, Cuba, Russia, Venezuela, and many capitalist systems that do, and that we have a historical precedent for when capitalism does work, what is your next step? What is the next functional system that provides this advantage for the future generations?
Well, I didn't realize I was taking such a moral position on these things. I felt that it was a little more scientific than that. But I can't speak to some of the examples you gave because I don't understand them or know about them well enough. But I don't think that when you're being beaten up, you have to say, I don't know if I want this guy to stop beating up on me until I find out what's going to happen later. I think we have to deal with oppression where it is. And then I just mentioned that last time I was speaking, we don't know what kind of society we will end up with. But human ingenuity and creativity and our natural impulses are limitless. And we will be able to develop within the context of a non-oppressive society. And that's what I'm talking about now. I don't think that's a moral position. I think that it's scientific in the sense that the kind of society we live in now creates conflict. And we have a situation where, as Tom just mentioned, Canada's, whatever you say it was, a wealthy country. Well, tell that to the people sleeping on the street, how wealthy this country is. They're part of the country, so this isn't a wealthy country. This is a country that has some wealthy people and some people sleeping on the street. And as long as we have that division and all what's in between, we are going to have conflict. And think about, why should we ever have that anyway? We are completely in control of our environment. What we do is our environment is dependent upon the way we treat it and how we use it. And people are using it, a minority of wealthy people are destroying it in the interest of making themselves even wealthier. And that is a situation that has to be addressed. It has to be addressed by the big majority in the world who have to organize and to come out and pass along to the next stage. And I think that stage is, in terms of what we're going to call ourselves, yes, it would be socialism, in the sense that we even out the unevenness in society and have everybody not competing and trying to get ahead and get something that somebody else doesn't have, but have ourselves as individuals develop. We're not going to be, equality doesn't mean we're all going to be the same. It means we're going to have equal possibilities to do whatever is our inclination as humans. So some of us might want to go bowling, and some of us might want to go to an art gallery, but that's okay. It doesn't matter.
So, thank you. I have 4 people that are waiting, and just for time-wise, just going to remind everyone to please keep the preamble to your question short, so that we can really get everyone involved.
Ben, this is Secretary. I actually had 2 questions, but I think the first part has mostly been answered more or less as you answered this question. And it would have been, Dr. Flanagan identified a number of countries like Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela currently, who have actually experimented with socialism, and it seems as though it didn't go very well. And the reason that we don't have them as they used to be, most of them have now moved towards capitalism, what we are calling capitalism, is probably suggestive that socialism may not work as much as we are thinking, or you are thinking that they would. So my question is, why do we think that socialism will work now if it didn't work in the past? And my question to Dr. Flanagan, I think Mr. Howard seems to be much concerned about the level of profits that are being made in the capitalist systems. Is it the case, or can we agree, is it true that some of the profits that are being made are not deserving, in the sense that they are to some extent exploitative? We see some of the responsibilities that we all want to see the businesses, corporations have, pollution or pollution control, etc. Do we have a collective responsibility? Because it seems as though we as the citizens, we want jobs to be created. And our government wants to help with that because that is good for them for election and re-elections. And so they want to satisfy that. And in doing that, they also have to get that from the businesses to create these jobs. So collectively, is there anything going on that prevents the businesses from being accountable as they ought to be? And that is because we are all part of the problem.
So I think there was first a question for Albert. So let's begin with that.
Could you clarify the question?
One sentence, the second question for...
So if socialism has not worked in the past, why do we think it's going to work now?
Well, I think this subject has been touched on before, but first of all, we live in a global economy, And socialism as the next stage is rejected by the conservative elements that are profiting from this stage. So they are rejected. And I mentioned that what happens is boycotts and all kinds of restrictions are foisted upon countries that attempt to initiate a social society. They're cut out of the global economy. And not only that, but they're politically interfered with by stimulating whoever the reactionaries are who want to stop the progressive elements of the socialist economy of the socialist country. Cuba is a good example of this. Tom mentioned before how Cuba was great before the revolution. I've never heard, I haven't heard anybody recently support the Batista regime. But Cuba before why do you think there was a revolution? There was incredible poverty. There was a playground for the mafia and the rich. It was unrestricted. It was gambling and prostitution was rampant. That was the economy, and that's why it was so easy for the Cuban Revolution. It didn't subscribe exactly to the Marxist analysis of how it happens because there wasn't a big there wasn't a big buildup of the left. That's what Che Guevara. That's what drove him to believe that he could keep doing it. He thought everybody was going to be inspired by that, but we saw what happened. However, the circumstances in Cuba were such that the people had enough and were inspired by the Castro revolutionaries. And look, I mean, how can you compare Cuba in the Batista regime with the Cuba now? Cuba's not a rich country because it's being punished by the imperialists. But it's even without that, now Cuba, I've been to Cuba a couple times. We have American business and American capitalist interests in Cuba partnering with them. All of the tourism and because they know how to do it. And we've got this small Caribbean country who can't exist outside or independently of the global economy. So since they're dependent upon it, then the global economy just manipulates them. But it's been, it's good and profitable for the American hotel companies and tourism and everything to go in there. And you should see what they're doing. They're corrupting the Cuban, the general thrust of the Cuban political dynamic. The first time I was in Cuba, there was no tipping, for instance, that assault on human dignity. And now, you should see what it's like. I mean, everybody's running around groveling at the feet of the tourists so they get these big tips. And what does that do to people? That I decide to give you what I feel you deserve, right? That's a backward step. And Cuba is now suffering a reactionary response to the revolution, which was very dialectically understood to be a country or an island for the people.
Thank you. To make sure that we can get more people in the conversation, I'm going to limit it to that one question, and again, I'll move on and try to give everyone who wants to participate a chance.
I have two questions of Albert, only two, but they'll be very quick, I'm sorry. And I hope they don't create any conflict. Medical doctors are generally involved in a small business with a profit motive. Similarly, the legal profession, my former profession, and the accounting profession, will doctors, lawyers, and accountants become civil servants in the inevitable future? And somewhat similarly, farms and farmers, big and small, are motivated by profit. In the inevitable post-capitalist world, will the farm real property necessarily be communized?
Okay, well, there's a number of different there are a number of different things here. First of all, I don't think the comparison between the legal profession and the medical profession is apt. The medical profession, the legal profession is a construct of the kind of society that we live in, which is which is determined by the law, and that shifts. But medical services are always necessary, and I think that the people who go into medicine initially are determined by the fact that they want to help and that they want to supply the services that medicine does for us and that benefits all of humanity. And that's what the kind of idealistic premise is with their what is the oath they take? It's the Hippocratic oath and so on and so forth. But no, you're right. What has happened is that capitalism is turning our doctors into businessmen. They are rewarded for various treatments instead of, well, take for example the way the medical system is run in the UK, where doctors are employed by the state. They are still devoted to their profession. They're just, you can't find something any much more honorable than teaching. I think that those two are very necessary and honorable professions, and they should be given the kind of living that they need, and they should be allowed to pursue that very important thing. I think a legal society, the way laws would be delivered, or the services would be delivered in a social society, would be that instead of having competing lawyers trying to win, no matter what somebody has done, if some lawyer can get away with getting him off, he's a successful lawyer. But we should have all cases and conflicts should be subjected to perhaps a panel of 3 lawyers who discuss the situation the way we would in a family. If you're a family and you've got 2 kids and they're having a fight with each other, one parent doesn't take one side and one the other and see who's smarter. And what they do is they try to figure out what the rational conclusion is and who should do what and stop doing something to somebody else. And that is the kind of thing that should be applied. That's a common social way of doing things. And that would make for a better legal system if we had that. And if you had extreme situations, you'd have perhaps a panel of 5 lawyers. And they would work it out the way the Supreme Court works, actually. That's that we don't have the Supreme Court competing with each other. So that was, what accountants? Well, accountants are just products of capitalism. Try to get you to not pay your taxes.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Schrader. I teach computer science here in the Faculty of Science and Technology. I want to push a little bit further on Dr. Miriam Carey's question from the beginning around the role of public education and publicly funded research and so forth in a capitalist economy. So just very quickly to frame it, of course, the history of science is full of examples of great innovations, mathematics, computing, relativity, quantum mechanics, immunotherapy for cancer research, which is a major breakthrough recently, that all derive from curiosity-driven research. The impetus didn't come directly from a profit motive or from price signals. It also didn't come from centralized planning. So if you accept maybe that that's a bit of a false dichotomy, how do you explain, especially Dr. Flanagan, what role does publicly funded research and scholarship play in a pure market-driven system? Thank you.
Well, I think there's probably a place for publicly funded research, and it certainly exists in every capitalist country. When you're talking about fields that are very far from profitability, industry will not support something that has got a reasonable expectation of profit eventually. So yes. However, the fact that there is public support of research doesn't mean it has to be governmental support, or it has to be totally governmental. There are many philanthropic individuals who are happy to support research for a variety of reasons. And I think it's a good thing to have a multiplicity of funders and it creates more diversity of interest and possibilities rather than having it all be funneled through the state. So I'm not saying the state should not fund any research, but I actually think it would be better if we could move away from the state dominating the funding, to the extent that we can, move away from the state dominating the funding of pure research and make it possible for other funders to, as they do now, exist to some extent. You know, the reality is when government funds research, an awful lot of it is sterile and wasted. I see in my own field of political science, you know, large amounts of money being channeled by government to people to, you know, to write books that nobody will ever read. I'm glad I got off that tit a long time ago.
Mr. Albert Howard, you mentioned the freedom from oppression and freedom from capitalistic culture. But even my understanding is that Karl Marx surmised that initial temporary oppression would be necessary in order to kickstart communist society, or else the people just wouldn't cooperate. But eventually, when they were able to see the benefits of it, then they would be able to relax the oppression and they enjoy the society that they built together. You mentioned universal. Is that because that it would only work if it was universal? Is that because there would be no place to run, so that if somebody did not wish to be part of the culture, there would be no place to go to? They wouldn't have to close the borders, because there would be no borders. Everybody would be socialist. Is that the only way it would work?
Well, there's a couple of things there. I'm not sure of your first premise of having to force people into a social society and outside of capitalism. The only people who wouldn't like it, of course, are the people who are benefiting by capitalism, which is that little minority out there that you know, that's accumulating all the wealth. Why else would people not want a society where they are free to, for personal development, not the exploitation of others, but free for personal development? We're human beings, and we have this incredible capability and possibility and potential to develop as individuals. And why would you not like that? If you didn't, if you were opposed to it, yes, you wouldn't have any place to run. Where? So somewhere where you can go and exploit someone? That won't be available to you. So I don't know how that kind of ideal of having a personal want or desire that should always be satisfied, that's certainly not satisfied under capitalism. Look at all the people who wouldn't like that, wish they weren't poor. You know, they don't have any place to run, and I don't understand the. There was a mention of, I guess Tom mentioned that a lot of government-funded. Sorry, I'm not speaking directly to what you said, but I did want to take that up. I don't think any research is wasted. I think it's like doctoral dissertations. They are on subjects quite abstract quite often, but they're not wasted. They are there on a shelf somewhere for somebody to refer to, and it happens. Sometime in the future, they're pulled out and they are relevant. So often because they were so progressive in the first place that there was no apparent use for them. But I think that.
Hi, my question's for Tom. My name's Alex, by the way, with the social work program. I'm just wondering about capitalism going forward into the future. When we think about automation, how do you think that's going to affect people who are going to be losing their jobs? Like, we could say that we have automation that's going to come forward and do a lot more production, but we're going to lose workers, and we're going to replace those, like, workers will be replaced by machines. We need people to fix the machines. That's not going to be a big balance. So how going forward is it going to be when people are out of work and there's less people in the workforce and there's more people who are going to be out of jobs, I guess? How are we going to go forward with that?
Well, I think that's another one of these doomsday scenarios, which in fact isn't upheld by the evidence. I've been hearing this, I'm 75 years old, I've been hearing this now for at least 70 years, whenever I first became aware of any political discussion around the dinner table. It's not just a case of having to need a few people to tend the machines. What happens is that the progress that you referred to creates whole new generations of wants in people and creates new industries and new jobs. Jobs are, and also with an aging population, a lot of people are getting out of the workforce. We have to entice them back in. Take a current example in the United States under the much despised President Trump. Unemployment is less than 4%. Historic rates of low unemployment, not only for white males, but for women, for black people, for Hispanics, for Asians, for everybody. There's greater demand for workers than ever. Now, I can't tell you exactly how that happens, but we see the process does work, that new wants create new jobs. And the nature of jobs changes. There may be fewer jobs for people whose main asset is just a strong back, but there will be jobs. And so, yes, some people are going to be displaced, and there's going to be some sad stories, yes. But overall, other jobs will be there. So of all the things I worry about, that's at the bottom of the list, is that the end of work. I just don't take that seriously. I mean, I don't worry about too much, but that's one I really don't worry about.
Hi there, I'll get right to it. Recently I was discussing with a friend of mine, and he's a Marxist, and I was telling him about my grandmother. And my grandmother lived in communist China, in a small village. It wasn't an easy life. She would have worked harder, more physically than people typically work over here, longer hours. It was not glamorous at all. But by any standard of the imagination from here, her life would be considered hard work. But she had one problem. Her and her husband owned a store. And so when the communists came along and found her at home, they dragged her out and they tortured her, because by their eyes, she wasn't a worker, she was bourgeois. And so when I relayed this to my friend, he told me that, well, my grandmother couldn't be entirely innocent because she ran a store where she bought things for $1 and charged people $2. And so she didn't take the other option where she could have bought things for $1, sold everything for cost, and then basically do this voluntary good to the community. Only then could she truly be blameless. Okay, I'll take his opinion as it is. So, Albert, was my grandmother responsible for the evils and sufferings in this world the same way that the Koch brothers are, just to a smaller degree?
No, she wasn't. Well, do you want me to elaborate on what absurd situation that happened? Well, first of all, you can't take the acts of individual people and attribute that to a Marxist theory. There are all kinds of situations where people misuse and do all kinds of things to each other under the guise of something. But that doesn't mean you can take it and say, well, then socialism doesn't work because your grandmother couldn't run her grocery store and some fanatic punished her. What has that got to do with the fact that we want to get rid of exploitive societies and the broader sense of a whole lot of incredibly rich people and a whole lot of people with not enough to eat in the world? That's unfortunate. There's a lot of similarities between Maoism and Stalinism, and both tried to do the same, in the sense that they both tried to do the same thing. They both said, we now have a social society